In the spring of 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat aboard the super battleship Yamato and contemplated the destruction of what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. 6 months of unbroken victory had swept across the ocean like a typhoon. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Indian Ocean. Every battle had ended the same way. Japanese triumph, Allied catastrophe. Yamamoto commanded the most powerful naval striking force the world had ever seen. 4 fleet carriers whose pilots had humiliated the Americans at Pearl Harbor and sunk the pride of the Royal Navy in open water. Now he would use that force to finish what he had started. Yamamoto understood something that many in the Japanese high command did not. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew American industrial capacity. Before the war, he had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year, but after that he had no confidence in the outcome. The attack on Midway was his attempt to destroy American carrier power before that industrial capacity could make itself felt. 7,000 miles away, in a windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a disheveled Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort was staring at rows of 5-digit numbers. He had not slept in 3 days. He was wearing carpet slippers and a smoking jacket over his khaki uniform. He had not bathed in longer than anyone cared to mention. The cramped cold space his team called the dungeon smelled of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and unwashed bodies. The constant clatter of IBM tabulating machines made conversation difficult. The numbers on the papers in front of Rochefort were fragments of intercepted Japanese radio messages, encrypted in a code the Imperial Japanese Navy believed was absolutely unbreakable. Rochefort looked at those fragments and told Admiral Chester Nimitz exactly where the Japanese would attack, exactly when they would arrive, and exactly what direction they would come from. He predicted the largest naval battle in history 3 weeks before it happened. Yamamoto believed the Americans were broken and demoralized after Pearl Harbor. Rochefort was about to prove him catastrophically wrong. The Japanese called it senshobyu, victory disease. It was the arrogance that came from winning too much, too easily, for too long. By May of 1942, Japan had conquered more territory in less time than any nation in modern history. The strategic situation appeared overwhelmingly favorable. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft had devastated the American battle fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,000 Americans. On December 10th, Japanese bombers had caught the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse without air cover and sent them to the bottom of the South China Sea. On February 15th, Singapore had surrendered with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marching into captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. By March, the Dutch East Indies had fallen. By April, Japanese forces had raided into the Indian Ocean, striking Ceylon and sending the Royal Navy fleeing to East Africa. The Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership looked at this record and saw confirmation of everything they believed about themselves and their enemies. Japanese warriors possessed a fighting spirit that Western nations could not match. American sailors were soft, undisciplined, and unprepared for the rigors of modern naval warfare. The divine wind of destiny was at Japan's back, but one event had unsettled this confidence. On April 18, 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid caused little physical damage, but the psychological impact was profound. Japanese citizens had been told the home islands were invulnerable. Now American bombs had fallen on the capital. The military had failed to protect the emperor. Yamamoto used the shock of the Doolittle raid to push through his plan. for attacking Midway. The operation would accomplish two objectives. It would extend Japan's defensive perimeter by capturing the atoll. More importantly, it would draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle. With American carrier power eliminated, Japan could consolidate its conquests and negotiate from strength. Operation M. I was elaborate to the point of fragility. Yamamoto assembled over 200 ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers, and 10 submarines. The fleet carried over 400 aircraft. Multiple task forces would be spread across thousands of miles of ocean, each with specific objectives and precise timetables that depended on everything going exactly right. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would lead the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, with 4 fleet carriers to neutralize Midway's defenses. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu together carried approximately 248 aircraft. These were the same carriers and many of the same pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor. A separate force would attack the Aleutian Islands to the north. Yamamoto himself would follow 300 miles behind Nagumo with the main battle fleet, including the super battleship Yamato with its 18-inch guns. When the Americans responded to the Midway attack, Yamamoto's battleships would close in and annihilate them. The complexity reflected Japanese overconfidence. They assumed they would achieve complete surprise. They assumed the Americans would react slowly and predictably. They assumed their submarine picket lines would detect any American fleet movement before it could threaten the operation. Most fatally, they assumed their codes were secure. When staff officers conducted war games to test the plan aboard the Yamato in early May, the exercises revealed serious vulnerabilities. Umpires ruled that during a simulated American air attack, Akagi and Kaga had sustained 9 bomb hits between them. The referees assessed both carriers as sunk. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, simply overruled the umpires. The damage was arbitrarily reduced. Akagi was ruled still operational. Kaga was resurrected from the dead. The war game continued as if nothing had happened. This was not an isolated incident of wishful thinking. It was a symptom of an organization that had stopped questioning its own assumptions. Japanese intelligence officers estimated that the American carrier Yorktown, badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, would need at least 3 months of repair before returning to action. They believed Operation K, a flying boat reconnaissance mission over Pearl Harbor, would confirm American carrier positions before the attack commenced. They assumed their submarine patrol line would detect any American fleet movements. Every single assumption was wrong. The roots of what happened at Midway stretched back decades before the first shot was fired. In 1929, a young Navy lieutenant named Joseph Rochefort arrived in Tokyo to study Japanese language and culture. The Navy had identified a need for officers who could understand potential adversaries, and Rochefort had shown an aptitude for languages and analytical thinking that made him a natural candidate. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900, Rochefort had enlisted in the Navy just before his 18th birthday and worked his way up through the ranks. He attended the Naval Academy Preparatory School, earned a commission, and caught the attention of senior officers who recognized his unusual abilities. He spent 3 years in Tokyo, immersing himself in Japanese society. He learned not just the language, but the patterns of thought behind it. He attended Japanese naval functions and observed officers in formal and informal settings. He came to understand how they communicated, how they approached problems, how they thought about strategy and tactics. This deep understanding would prove invaluable when he later tried to predict what Japanese commanders would do. On the voyage to Tokyo, Rochefort formed a friendship with another young officer, also assigned to study Japanese. Lieutenant Edwin Layton was a different personality, more conventional and politically adept, but the two men shared an intellectual curiosity about Japan and a dedication to their professional development. Their friendship, forged during those 3 years of language classes and social events, would prove essential when the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance. Rochefort returned to the United States and joined the Navy's Small Signals intelligence operation. He trained under Commander Lawrence Safford, the officer who had built Navy cryptanalysis from almost nothing and who would later be called the father of Navy cryptology. He also worked with Agnes Meyer Driscoll, one of the most brilliant code breakers in American history, who had broken multiple Japanese naval codes and developed analytical techniques that remained in use for years. Under their guidance, Rochefort learned the painstaking craft of extracting meaning from encrypted gibberish. By December 1941, Commander Rochefort led Station Hypo, the Navy's Pacific Fleet Radio Intelligence Unit. His domain was a basement beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor, a cramped space roughly the size of a tennis court, filled with IBM tabulating machines, desks piled high with paper, and exhausted cryptanalysts working around the clock. The machines ran constantly, punching and sorting cards with a clatter that made normal conversation impossible. The lack of windows made it impossible to tell day from night. The basement was kept cold to prevent the machines from overheating, and staff wore sweaters and jackets even in tropical Hawaii. Rochefort loved it. He ran his unit unlike any other command in the Navy. There were no formal inspections, no strict dress codes, no requirement to address superiors by rank. Rochefort himself wandered the basement in his smoking jacket and carpet slippers, chain-smoking cigarettes, sometimes working 20 hours straight before collapsing on a cot beside his desk. He went days without bathing. He ate meals at his desk. His philosophy was simple. Talent mattered more than appearance. Results mattered more than protocol. "We can accomplish anything," he told his team, provided no one cares who gets the credit. Rochefort handpicked his staff, recruiting the best cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, and linguists he could find. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, known as Tommy, a mathematical genius who was considered by many the finest cryptanalyst in the Navy. Dyer worked in near isolation at a cluttered desk decorated with a hula dancer doll and pin-up photos. A hand-lettered sign above his workspace read, "You do not have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." Dyer had written that sign himself. He would work 2 and 3 days at a stretch before being sent home, and he had sacrificed grade advancement by repeatedly refusing sea duty so he could continue his cryptographic work. Some considered him the father of machine cryptanalysis for his pioneering use of IBM equipment. Commander Wesley Wright, known universally as Ham, was a genial, heavy-set man. He possessed an intuitive brilliance for cryptanalysis, working alongside Dyer to unravel the complex Japanese codes. Ham could keep thousands of pieces of information in his head simultaneously, fitting them together like an enormous jigsaw puzzle, with most of the pieces always missing. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan was a Naval Academy graduate who had served as a language officer in Tokyo before the war. When the attack on Pearl Harbor damaged his ship, the battleship Tennessee, Finnegan found himself without a berth. Rochefort knew him from their Tokyo days and immediately had him transferred to Station Hypo. Finnegan combined linguistic skill with cryptanalytic ability and would prove crucial to breaking the date-time encryption that revealed when the Midway attack would occur. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes was a former submarine officer and published author who wrote adventure stories for the Saturday Evening Post under the pen name Alec Hudson. Arthritis of the spine had forced his retirement from active duty, and he had joined the faculty at the University of Hawaii. When war came, he was recalled to duty and assigned to Station Hypo as an intelligence analyst. His knowledge of submarine operations and his creative thinking would prove essential. Rochefort also recruited an unusual group of assistants. When the battleship California was damaged at Pearl Harbor, her band was left without a ship. Rochefort had the bandsmen reassigned to Station Hypo and retrained as IBM machine operators. He reasoned that their musical skills, the ability to quickly read and process complex notation, would make them adept at the mathematical problem-solving required for cryptanalysis. The same abilities that helped them sight-read music would help them process the streams of numbers flowing through the tabulating machines. He was right. The problem Rochefort's team faced was staggering in its complexity. The Japanese Navy's primary operational code was designated JN-25 by American intelligence. It was the code used for operational communications, the messages that coordinated fleet movements, assigned missions, and directed attacks. If it could be broken, Station Hypo could tell Nimitz what the Japanese were planning. JN-25 was a two-part super-enciphered system of almost diabolical sophistication. The first layer was a codebook containing approximately 45,000 5-digit number groups. Each group represented a word, phrase, or location. A particular 5-digit number might mean carrier or attack or a specific geographic designator. The second layer was a set of additive tables containing random numbers that were added to the code groups before transmission. This double encryption made the system extraordinarily difficult to break. To read a JN-25 message, Rochefort's team first had to strip off the additive through painstaking mathematical analysis. This alone could take days or weeks for a single message, as they searched for patterns in the numbers that might reveal which additive table had been used and what values had been added. Then they had to match the underlying code groups to their meanings, a process that required educated guessing, intuition, and deep knowledge of Japanese naval procedures and terminology. They worked without computers in the modern sense. They had IBM, punch card tabulators, pencils, reams of paper, and human intuition developed over years of experience. The tabulators could sort and compare cards at high speed, but identifying the patterns still required human insight. Worse, the Japanese changed both the codebook and the additive tables periodically. Every time they did, the Americans had to start over, laboriously rebuilding their understanding of the new system. A change scheduled for early 1942 was delayed in the confusion of Japan's rapid expansion across the Pacific. That delay gave Rochefort's team precious additional weeks to penetrate the current version of the code. By April of 1942, Station Hypo could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted Japanese naval traffic. They were decrypting and translating around 140 messages per day, working from fragmentary intercepts that often contained gaps and garbled sections. Most messages remained partially or completely unreadable. Filling in the blanks required educated guesswork based on knowledge of Japanese naval terminology, standard message formats, and likely content. That fragment of insight was enough to change history. The first indication that something major was coming appeared in late April. Japanese radio traffic increased dramatically. Rochefort's team noticed repeated references to a location designated AF. They also intercepted requests for navigation charts covering Midway Island and the surrounding area. The pattern suggested a major operation in the Central Pacific. Then came more clues. Partially decoded messages mentioned a date-time group that Rochefort's analysts believed corresponded to early June. The messages discussed an operation of tremendous scale. Ships were being assigned, aircraft were being allocated, supplies were being positioned, invasion transports were mentioned. The fragments painted a picture of an offensive larger than anything Japan had yet attempted. Rochefort studied the incomplete intelligence and reached a conclusion. The Japanese were planning a major attack against Midway Atoll, an isolated speck of coral and sand, roughly 1,100 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. The attack would come in early June, probably around the 3rd or 4th. He was confident in his analysis. Washington was not. The rivalry between Station Hypo in Hawaii and OP-20G in Washington had been building for months, rooted in bureaucratic politics, personal animosities, and genuine disagreements about how intelligence should be analyzed and distributed. In February 1942, Captain John Redman took command of OP-20G. Redman was a communications officer with no training in cryptanalysis and no knowledge of the Japanese language. His brother, Captain Joseph Redman, became Director of Naval Communications the same month. Together, the Redman brothers represented a bureaucratic faction that viewed Rochefort's independent operation with suspicion and resentment. The official chain of command required Rochefort to send his raw intercepts and preliminary analysis to Washington, where OP-20G would compile it with intelligence from other sources and distribute finished assessments to operational commanders. In practice, Rochefort bypassed this system entirely, communicating his findings directly to Admiral Nimitz through his friend Edwin Layton, who was now Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer. This side channel worked superbly within the Pacific Theater, giving Nimitz timely intelligence he could act upon. But it infuriated officials in Washington who believed Rochefort was short-circuiting the system and usurping their authority. When Rochefort reported his analysis that AF meant Midway and the attack would come in early June, Washington disagreed vehemently. OP-20G analysts believed the Japanese target was not Midway but somewhere else entirely. Perhaps the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, perhaps Port Moresby in New Guinea, perhaps Samoa, Fiji, or New Caledonia in the South Pacific, perhaps even the American West Coast or Hawaii itself. Washington also placed the attack in mid-June rather than early June. The Redman brothers sent constant memos to Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, arguing against Rochefort's Midway assessment. They insisted he was wrong. They demanded that Hawaii's analysis be overruled and that Rochefort be brought under tighter Washington control. Rochefort faced a difficult problem. He was confident in his analysis, but confidence was not proof. The code fragments left room for interpretation. Station Hypo could read only portions of most messages, and filling in the blanks required educated guesswork. Washington's skepticism, while frustrating, was not entirely unreasonable given the incomplete nature of the intelligence. Rochefort needed something definitive to prove his case. The solution came from Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes. Holmes knew that Midway Atoll was connected to Hawaii by an underwater submarine cable that the Japanese could not intercept. He proposed a clever ruse to confirm that AF meant Midway. The garrison on Midway would send an unencrypted radio message reporting that the island's water desalination plant had suffered serious damage. The island was running short of fresh water. Rochefort approved the idea immediately. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. If AF was indeed Midway, Japanese intelligence would intercept the fake distress message and report it to Tokyo. That report would be encrypted in JN-25 and transmitted by radio. American listening stations would intercept the Japanese message. Station Hypo would decrypt it and see whether it mentioned AF having water problems. Around May 19th, the garrison at Midway transmitted the fake emergency report via open radio. stating that an explosion had damaged the desalination system and the island had only enough water for 2 weeks. A follow-up report was sent using a strip cipher code system that the Japanese were known to have captured on Wake Island. The bait was set. 3 days later, on May 22nd, the American listening station in Melbourne intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. When decoded, the message stated that AF was short of fresh drinking water. The ruse worked perfectly. AF was Midway. There was no longer any room for doubt about the target. But the water shortage trick was not designed to reveal the target to Rochefort. He already knew. The ruse was designed to convince Washington. Historian Craig Simons later explained that the test confirmed rather than revealed the target. Rochefort did it to help convince Washington that he knew what he was talking about. Even with the AF confirmation, the Redman brothers continued to argue against Rochefort's overall assessment. The bureaucratic battle continued even as the Japanese fleet prepared to sail. On May 26th and 27th, Lieutenant Finnegan and Commander Ham Wright achieved another crucial breakthrough. The Japanese encrypted their date-time information using a separate garbled cipher, making it difficult to determine exactly when operations were scheduled to occur. Through painstaking analysis of message traffic, Finnegan discovered the method the Japanese used to lock up their date-time groups. Working together, he and Wright cracked this additional layer of encryption. Their breakthrough clinched the pivotal date of the operation as either June 4th or 5th. During May, Rochefort's team decrypted, translated, reviewed, analyzed, and reported as many as 140 messages per day. They worked around the clock, grabbing sleep when they could, sustained by coffee and cigarettes and the knowledge that the fate of the Pacific might depend on their work. What finally made the difference was Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz had taken command of the Pacific Fleet in the dark days after Pearl Harbor, inheriting a shattered force and a demoralized officer corps. He was calm, methodical, and willing to trust the judgment of officers he respected, even when that judgment contradicted the views of his superiors in Washington. Nimitz retained Edwin Layton as his intelligence officer despite the Pearl Harbor disaster, recognizing his unique talents and his close working relationship with Rochefort. Layton was one of only 2 staff officers, with standing permission to enter Nimitz's office at any time without an appointment. Nimitz told Layton his job was to think like Admiral Yamamoto, to predict what the Japanese commander intended to do before he did it, to get inside his mind. Layton and Rochefort had studied Japanese together in Tokyo over a decade earlier. They trusted each other completely. When Rochefort's analysis came through, Layton took it directly to Nimitz, explaining the evidence and the reasoning behind Station Hypo's conclusions. Nimitz listened carefully, asked probing questions, and made his decision. On May 27, 1942, Layton delivered Station Hypo's final prediction to Nimitz. The Japanese carriers would attack on the morning of June 4th. They would approach from the northwest, on a bearing of 325 degrees. They could be sighted at approximately 175 miles from Midway at around 0700 local time. The prediction was extraordinarily specific. It was also extraordinarily risky. If Rochefort was wrong, if the Japanese attacked somewhere else or at a different time, the consequences would be catastrophic. Nimitz issued Operation Plan 29-42, ordering his 3 available carriers to proceed to a point northeast of Midway designated Point Luck. Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 28th. Spruance was substituting for Vice Admiral William Halsey, who was hospitalized with a severe skin condition. 2 days later, Task Force 17 with Yorktown followed after emergency repairs. The repair of Yorktown was itself a small miracle. The carrier had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, with a bomb penetrating to her fourth deck. Initial estimates suggested repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz ordered it done in 3 days. Shipyard workers swarmed over the vessel around the clock, working in shifts that never stopped. They accomplished the impossible. Japanese intelligence had estimated Yorktown would be unavailable for months. They were wrong by approximately 89 days. Nimitz was committing 75% of his Pacific Fleet carrier strength based largely on the analysis of a disheveled commander who wore carpet slippers to work and had not bathed in days. If the Japanese struck somewhere else, if they came on a different day, if they approached from a different direction, the American carriers would be out of position. Hawaii would be exposed. The war in the Pacific could be lost. General George Marshall later assessed the decision with characteristic bluntness. As a result of cryptanalysis, he said, the Americans were able to concentrate their limited forces to meet the Japanese naval advance on Midway. Otherwise, they would have been 3,000 miles out of place. The Japanese fleet sailed in late May, supremely confident of victory. But the carefully planned operation began going wrong almost immediately. Operation K, the flying boat reconnaissance mission intended to confirm the location of American carriers at Pearl Harbor, was cancelled when American ships were found at the planned refueling point. The submarine picket line that was supposed to detect American fleet movements arrived at its patrol stations too late. The American carriers had already passed through the area and taken up position northeast of Midway. Nagumo's Kido Butai sailed into a trap without knowing it. The Americans knew he was coming. They knew approximately when. They knew from what direction. They were waiting. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft to strike Midway. At 5:34 local time, a Navy Catalina patrol plane spotted the incoming Japanese formation and radioed the first contact report. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150 miles. The battle had begun exactly as Rochefort predicted. Japanese bombs fell on Midway at 6:30. The attacking aircraft inflicted significant damage, hitting fuel storage tanks, a seaplane hangar, and other facilities. But the island's defenses remained operational. The strike leader radioed Nagumo that the American defenses had not been neutralized and a second attack would be necessary. Nagumo faced his first critical decision. His reserve aircraft, sitting on the hangar decks of his carriers, had been armed with torpedoes for use against ships in case American carriers appeared. Should he keep them ready for a possible naval engagement? Or should he rearm them with bombs for another strike on Midway? At 7:15, with no report of American carriers in the area, Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed with bombs. Flight deck crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and installing bombs, a task that would take about an hour. At 7:28, a Japanese scout plane finally reported American surface ships to the northeast. The message was fragmentary and unclear. It mentioned ships but did not specify what type. Nagumo urgently requested clarification. Were there carriers? The answer would determine everything. At 7:45, the scout reported that the American force appeared to include a carrier. Nagumo immediately reversed his order. Aircraft that had just been armed with bombs were to be rearmed once again with torpedoes for an attack on the American ships. The flight decks of 4 Japanese carriers became scenes of controlled chaos as crews worked desperately to switch weapons for the second time that morning. Bombs were lowered into magazines. Torpedoes were hoisted from storage. Aviation fuel lines snaked across decks crowded with aircraft. While the Japanese frantically rearmed, American aircraft were already approaching. The American torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet first. They came in low and slow, lumbering Douglas devastators that were easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked at 9:18. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 aircraft toward the Japanese carriers. They had no fighter escort. The escorting Wildcats had become separated during the long flight. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns annihilated them. 14 aircraft were shot down during the attack run. The 15th crashed into the sea. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water amid the wreckage with a seat cushion for flotation. He watched the rest of the battle unfold from the surface of the Pacific. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 10 of 14 aircraft were destroyed without scoring any hits. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown made its attack. This was the only torpedo squadron with fighter escort, 6 Wildcats that tried to hold off the swarm of Zeros. 10 of 12 Devastators were shot down. In less than an hour, American torpedo bombers had been virtually annihilated. 35 of 41 aircraft were destroyed. Not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. It was one of the most devastating losses in American naval aviation history. But the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers had a crucial unintended consequence. Japanese Zero fighters had chased the low-flying attackers down to wave top level to intercept them. The combat air patrol that should have been protecting the fleet at altitude was now at sea level, low on fuel and ammunition. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were focused on the horizon, watching for more torpedo planes. No one was watching the sky directly overhead. At approximately 10:20, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived almost simultaneously at high altitude. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet for hours, flying at the extreme limit of their fuel range. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had reached the estimated interception point and found empty ocean. The Japanese had changed course. McCluskey faced a critical decision. His aircraft were low on fuel. If he searched much longer, some would not make it back to the carrier. He could turn back or he could gamble. McCluskey made what Nimitz later called one of the most important decisions of the battle. Rather than turning for home, he continued the search. His gamble paid off when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing at high speed. The destroyer Arashi had left the fleet formation to depth charge an American submarine and was now hurrying to rejoin Nagumo. McCluskey followed the destroyer's course northeast. At 10:20, he found the Japanese carriers. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived almost simultaneously, approaching from different directions. The timing was coincidental, but perfect. The Japanese combat air patrol was at sea level after chasing torpedo bombers. The anti-aircraft gunners were looking the wrong way. The flight decks below were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading a section of Enterprise dive bombers, pushed over into his attack dive on Akagi. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's bombers against Soryu. Other Enterprise aircraft dove on Kaga. In approximately 5 to 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers received fatal wounds. Akagi took a hit near her midships elevator that penetrated to the hangar deck and detonated among armed and fueled aircraft. Kaga was struck by multiple bombs that started uncontrollable fires among aircraft parked on her flight deck and hangar. Soryu took 3 hits that turned her into an inferno from bow to stern. Within minutes, the heart of Japan's carrier striking force was ablaze. 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were dying. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial attack because she was positioned several miles from the other 3. Her air group commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterstrike. 18 dive bombers found Yorktown and scored 3 hits, starting fires and jamming her rudder. American damage control parties worked furiously and got the carrier moving again. In the early afternoon, Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers found Yorktown and put 2 torpedoes into her port side. The damage was too severe. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship, but Hiryu's reprieve was temporary. American scout planes found her in the late afternoon. At approximately 1700, dive bombers from Enterprise attacked. 4 bombs struck Hiryu, starting fires that soon raged out of control. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. One of Japan's most capable carrier commanders lost along with his vessel. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or abandoned. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of Japanese naval aviation, the ships that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were dying in flames on the water. Yamamoto received the news aboard Yamato, 300 miles to the rear. His elaborate plan had collapsed in a single afternoon. He briefly considered pressing on with his battleships, seeking a night surface action, but his staff convinced him the situation was hopeless. Without carrier air cover, his battleships would be helpless against American air attack when daylight returned. He ordered the retreat. The Battle of Midway continued for 3 more days as American forces pursued the withdrawing Japanese fleet. On June 6th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found the heavy cruisers Mogami and Makuma, which had collided during the night while evading an American submarine. Makuma was sunk. Mogami, badly damaged, limped back to Japan. Yorktown, which had survived the battle itself, was taken under tow for salvage operations. On June 6th, the Japanese submarine Force 168 found the crippled carrier and fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, 1 hit the destroyer Hamon, which was alongside assisting with salvage. Hamon broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. Yorktown capsized and sank the following morning. The final accounting was devastating for Japan. 4 fleet carriers sunk. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. Approximately 290 to 320 aircraft destroyed, virtually all of them going down with the carriers. Over 3,000 personnel killed, including more than 100 experienced pilots and over 700 aircraft mechanics and maintenance specialists whose skills could not be quickly replaced. American losses were significant but survivable. 1 carrier sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, approximately 145 aircraft destroyed, 307 sailors and airmen killed. The numbers told only part of the story. Japan's 4 carriers represented the core of their offensive naval aviation capability. The pilots and crews who died with them had trained for years before the war. Japan would build more carriers, but the experienced aviators who gave those ships their striking power could not be replaced in months or years. After Midway, Japan would never again mount a major offensive in the Pacific. 6 months later, American forces would land on Guadalcanal and begin the long march toward Tokyo. Admiral Nimitz assessed the battle with characteristic understatement. Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence, he said. In attempting to ambush us, the Japanese were themselves ambushed. On the morning of June 4th, as the first sighting reports confirmed the accuracy of Station Hypo's prediction, Nimitz had turned to Edwin Layton with a slight smile. "Well," he said, "you were only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles off." Rochefort's prediction had been almost perfect. The Japanese arrived from the direction he specified. They appeared at almost exactly the time he forecast. The battle occurred on the precise date he had predicted 3 weeks earlier. It was the most successful intelligence prediction in naval history. The man who made it should have been celebrated as a hero. Instead, The Navy tried to destroy his career. Less than 3 weeks after the battle on June 20th, 1942, both Redman brothers wrote memos to their superiors. They claimed that the victory at Midway was solely the achievement of OP-20G in Washington. They called Rochefort uncooperative and troublesome. They recommended he be replaced by a senior officer trained in radio intelligence who would follow proper procedures. Admiral Nimitz had immediately recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal. The Redman brothers blocked the recommendation. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, who reportedly disliked Rochefort personally and considered him one of the most unmilitary-looking officers he had ever encountered, denied the medal. The Distinguished Service Medal was awarded instead to Captain Joseph Redman. In October 1942, Rochefort received word that he was being transferred to Washington. He understood immediately that this was his relief from Station Hypo. The transfer became official on November 16th. Rochefort refused to work under the Redman's authority in intelligence. His subsequent assignments were a form of professional exile. He commanded a floating dry dock in San Francisco. Later he headed a Pacific intelligence section of lesser importance. He never returned to the operational cryptanalysis work he had revolutionized. The injustice was compounded by decades of secrecy. The role of code-breaking in the Midway victory remained classified for years after the war ended. Rochefort could not defend himself publicly because the very existence of his work was secret. The official histories credited American courage, luck, and fighting spirit. They did not mention the disheveled commander in carpet slippers who had predicted the battle 3 weeks in advance. Captain Edward Beach, a naval officer and historian who studied the Midway intelligence operation, later concluded that Rochefort had made more difference at a more important time than any naval officer in history. Yet Rochefort spent the remainder of his naval career in obscurity, his achievement unrecognized, his reputation tarnished by bureaucratic rivals who claimed credit for his work. Rochefort retired from the Navy in 1953 and died on July 20th, 1976, in Torrance, California. He was 76 years old. 1 month before his death, the film Midway premiered in theaters. The actor Hal Holbrook portrayed Rochefort, but Rochefort himself never saw the finished film. The campaign to restore his reputation began after his death. Rear Admiral Donald Showers, who had served under Rochefort at Station Hypo as a young ensign, led the effort. Showers gathered testimony from surviving codebreakers. He documented the intelligence operation in meticulous detail. He built the case for the recognition Rochefort had always deserved. On May 30th, 1986, 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan presented the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously to Rochefort's family at a White House ceremony. The citation stated that Rochefort's intelligence served as the singular basis for the fleet commander to plan his defenses, deploy his limited forces, and devise strategy to ensure United States Navy success. In the year 2000, Rochefort was inducted into the National Security Agency's Hall of Honor. On January 6, 2012, the Captain Joseph J. Rochefort Building was dedicated at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, on the same ground where he had worked in the basement 7 decades earlier. The recognition came too late for Rochefort himself, but it established for history what those who worked with him always knew. The Battle of Midway was not won by luck. It was won by intelligence, analysis, and the courage to trust unconventional thinking over bureaucratic consensus. The lessons of Midway extend far beyond that battle in the Central Pacific. The Japanese lost because they believed what they wanted to believe. Their codes were secure. Their plans were brilliant. Their enemies were demoralized and weak. Every assumption flattered their self-image. Every assessment confirmed what they already thought they knew. When wargame referees ruled against them, they changed the rules. When subordinates raised concerns, they were ignored. This was not stupidity. The Japanese officers who planned Operation MY were intelligent, experienced professionals. They had won every battle for 6 months. Their confidence was based on genuine achievement, but confidence became arrogance, and arrogance became blindness. They stopped questioning their assumptions at precisely the moment when questioning was most essential. The Americans won because a handful of men in a basement refused to accept comfortable assumptions. Rochefort and his team worked with fragmentary evidence and incomplete information. They could read only a fraction of Japanese traffic. They filled gaps with analysis, intuition, and educated guessing. They reached conclusions that contradicted what the experts in Washington believed, and they were right. Nimitz won because he was willing to trust the unconventional over the conventional. He bet his fleet on fragmentary intelligence and the judgment of analysts who contradicted Washington. He committed the bulk of his carrier strength based on code fragments and informed speculation. It was the riskiest decision of the Pacific War. It was also the wisest. The codebreakers who worked in that basement have passed from living memory. Rochefort died in 1976. Leighton died in 1984. Tommy Dyer and Ham Wright and Joe Finnegan are all gone. The machines they used are museum pieces. The basement where they worked is now a memorial, but the principles they demonstrated endure. Organizations still mistake confidence for competence. Leaders still surround themselves with advisors who tell them what they want to hear. Intelligence still gets dismissed when it contradicts established beliefs. Bureaucracies still punish those who challenge institutional consensus, even when those challenges are proved right. The men who planned Midway from Tokyo were not fools. They were professionals who had stopped questioning their own assumptions. The men who predicted Midway from a basement in Hawaii were not geniuses. They were analysts who refused to stop questioning until they found the truth. Admiral Yamamoto himself understood the magnitude of the defeat. When reports of the disaster reached the Yamato, he sat in stunned silence. Staff officers noted that he seemed to age years in a single night. He had gambled everything on destroying American carrier power, and instead his own carriers had been destroyed. The strategic situation he had warned about before the war, Japan facing a prolonged conflict against American industrial might, was now inevitable. The pilots who died at Midway represented years of intensive training that Japan could not quickly replace. Each carrier aviator had undergone a rigorous selection and training process. Japan had begun the war with approximately 2,000 carrier-qualified aviators. The losses at Midway, combined with attrition in other battles, meant the core of experienced pilots was being steadily depleted. New aviators rushed through abbreviated training programs would never match the skill of those lost. The four carriers themselves, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had taken years to build and represented an enormous investment of resources. Japan would construct new carriers during the war, but they would never again concentrate the same striking power that had dominated the Pacific from Pearl Harbor through the Indian Ocean. For the codebreakers, Midway validated their methods but did not end their work. The war would continue for more than 3 years. Station Hypo and its successor organizations would continue breaking Japanese codes, providing intelligence that shaped operations from Guadalcanal to the Philippines to Okinawa. The principles Rochefort established, the combination of cryptanalysis and traffic analysis, the integration of linguistic and technical skills, the focus on providing actionable intelligence to operational commanders, became the foundation of modern signals intelligence. The difference between victory and defeat, between 4 carriers burning on the water and an empire's offensive power, broken, came down to something simple. One side saw reality as it was. The other saw reality as they wished it to be. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold accounts. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, and we appreciate every one of you. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.